In all of human history, which palace was the largest? The answer depends on how we define largest. Take the Palace of Versailles, for example. If its vast gardens are included, its total area reaches an astonishing 8 square kilometers. But by any standard, the Weiyang Palace of the Han Dynasty, covering 4.8 square kilometers, stands as one of the most competitive contenders in the history of world palatial architecture. For comparison, Beijing's Forbidden City, the Imperial Palace of the Ming and Qing dynasties, covers 0.72 square kilometers, only about 1/7 the size of Weiyang Palace. But this is not the greatest secret of Han Chang'an. In fact, Weiyang Palace was not even the largest palace inside Han Chang'an. Today's video makes 2 breakthroughs that, as far as we know, have never been achieved before. First, this may be the first comprehensive interpretation on the internet of the complete layout, functions, and architecture of Han Chang'an. Through an AI reconstruction that took us hundreds of hours to produce, we will restore in full the Chinese capital of more than 2,000 years ago. Second, we will reveal to a global audience, perhaps for the first time, a fact that took Chinese archaeology more than 70 years to establish. Han Chang'an was not really a city at all. The 36 square kilometers inside the city walls of Han Chang'an were, in essence, one enormous palace city. Han Chang'an was fundamentally different from Rome, Alexandria, Seleucia, and other great cities of the same era. It was also completely different from all later Chinese capitals. Han Chang'an was not a city built for ordinary human life. It was the residence of the Son of Heaven. Its purpose, its design, and its very existence were all meant to shape and strengthen the divine authority of the emperor. It was a palace dedicated to the imperial house. It was a temple linking heaven and mankind. This is not our personal speculation, nor is it a sensational claim. It is the conclusion reached after 70 years of archaeology, through countless research reports and excavations by Chinese scientists and archaeologists. Beginning in 1956, the Institute of Archaeology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences began a systematic survey of Han Chang'an. Over the following decades, archaeologists uncovered the city step by step, from its walls to its gates, from its roads to its palaces. Han Chang'an was built close to the southern bank of the Wei River. Its walls measured 25.7 kilometers in total length, and the area enclosed by them was 36 square kilometers. On the land that is now Xi'an, the capital of Shanxi province, the ruins of Han Chang'an stand apart, almost lonely and out of place. Across the Wei River to the north lies the site of Weiyang Palace, the capital complex of the Qin dynasty. To the southeast lies the site of Han Chang'an, which later became the Ming and Qing city of Xi'an, and which remains the core area of modern Xi'an today. Visitors to Xi'an can still see the Ming and Qing city walls. They enclose an area of about 11 square kilometers. Han Chang'an was more than 3 times larger. The walls of Han Chang'an did not form a perfect square. One explanation is that the walls had to follow the course of the Wei River and therefore bent with the terrain. But another explanation comes closer to the city's real intention. The city was designed according to the patterns of the heavens and then reflected onto the human world. The bends in the northern wall correspond to the path of the northern dipper, while the bends in the southern wall correspond to the southern dipper in Chinese astronomy. That is why Han Chang'an was known as the Dipper City. There were 12 city gates in total. Inside the walls, 8 major avenues divided the city into 11 zones. These 8 avenues connected to 8 of the city gates, because the other 4 gates led directly to the palace gates of Weiyang Palace and Changle Palace. At first glance, this may seem similar to the 14 districts of Rome under Augustus, except that China did not yet have the same concept of urban districts. In a sense, the archaeology of Han Chang'an since 1956 has been the process of investigating these 11 zones one by one. Their definitions, their functions, their ruins, and the artifacts left behind. Over time, we moved closer and closer to the truth. But the final piece of the puzzle was not completed until 2024 and 2025. In January 2026, the Institute of Archaeology of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences released its report on archaeological work from 2025. One of its most important sections concerned the archaeology of the Weiyang Palace area of Han Chang'an. After 70 years of effort, scientists and archaeologists finally identified the main content of the last unresolved zone among the 11. So what were these 11 zones? In the central and southern parts of the city stood Weiyang Palace, including the armory and the Eastern Mansion's residential area to its south. Changle Palace, Gui Palace, North Palace, and Weiyang Palace. Together, these occupied 5 zones. In the northwest were craft workshops and markets, occupying 3 zones. Only the remaining areas were used for aristocratic mansions and ordinary residential neighborhoods. And in actual land area, these last 3 zones were far smaller than the palace zones that included Weiyang Palace and Changle Palace. In other words, within the 36 square kilometers of Han Chang'an, the space truly left for ordinary residents was less than 1/3 of the city. This is what made Han Chang'an fundamentally different from almost every ancient capital in the world. Spatially speaking, more than 2/3 of Han Chang'an belonged directly to the palace areas or served them. Functionally speaking, after closer examination, we can almost say that every inch of land within those 36 square kilometers, every design, every detail, and every moment of life there existed for the sacred authority of the emperor. Han Chang'an was not a city. It was a palace city. Han Chang'an had 3 gates on each side of the city, 12 gates in total. Each gate had 3 passageways. Altogether, that made 12 gates and 36 gate passages. Each passage was about 6 to 8 meters wide, roughly enough for 4 carriages to pass side by side. But the 3 passages of each gate were not designed only for traffic efficiency. They expressed a strict system of hierarchy and rank. This system, beginning with Han Chang'an, continued all the way to the end of Imperial China. It was closely tied to the great avenues connected to the city gates. Inside Chang'an, the 8 avenues connected to the 8 major city gates. Even the narrowest of these avenues was 45 meters wide, roughly equivalent to 15 modern traffic lanes. Each avenue was divided into 3 lanes by 2 drainage ditches, about 0.9 meters wide. The lanes on both sides were called side roads, each about 12 meters wide. The central lane, about 20 meters wide, was called the Qidao, the Imperial Road, reserved exclusively for the emperor. The side lanes, each about 12 meters wide, were for officials and commoners. Naturally, the same rules applied to the gates. The 3 gate passages corresponded to the 3 lanes of the road. The middle passage was the widest, while the 2 side passages were narrower. Even the side gates were not open for commoners to use as they pleased. People had to follow a strict rule: exit on the left, enter on the right. Most importantly, Han Chang'an enforced a strict gate control system. Anyone entering or leaving the city had to present credentials proving their identity and their legitimate reason for passing through the gates. As for the palace gates leading to Weiyang's palace, Changle Palace, and other palace compounds, the security was even tighter. Ordinary people had absolutely no chance of entering the palace areas. From the use of the gates and roads alone, you can clearly see that this city was not designed for the production and daily life of ordinary residents. It was designed to display and distinguish hierarchy. Of course, this hierarchy was not aimed only at ordinary people. The emperor was the #1 person under heaven. Apart from him, no one could stand at his level. Not even the crown prince was allowed to travel on the imperial road. The Book of Han records preserves a famous story. When Emperor Cheng of Han was still crown prince, he lived in Weiyang Palace. One day, he was urgently summoned by the emperor. He left through the Dragon Tower Gate on the south side of Weiyang Palace. Across the Imperial Road stood Weiyang Palace, where the emperor lived. But facing the Qidao that ran through the city, the crown prince did not dare cross it directly. Instead, he had to detour west to Jicheng Gate, cross the Imperial Road through the gate, and only then turn east into Weiyang Palace. Han law regarding the Imperial Road was extremely strict. Even nobles who received special permission from the emperor to use the Imperial Road could only travel along its very edge. The central strip, approximately 9 meters wide, was absolutely forbidden. Anyone who violated the rule would have their carriage and horses confiscated. Throughout the historical records of the Han Dynasty, there are many cases in which even princes, imperial relatives, and senior princesses were stopped or punished by officials for violating the rules of the Imperial Road. It was precisely these roads and gates, symbols of rank, order, and law, that divided Chang'an into 11 zones. Next, we will explain the contents of each zone one by one, and what each represented within this city of the Son of Heaven. Weiyang Palace was the emperor's residence and the center of political life in the empire. Almost every core affair related to imperial politics took place here. It stood in the southwestern part of Han Chang'an. Its plan was nearly square, covering 4.8 square kilometers. Its palace walls measured 8,800 meters in circumference, with one gate on each side. What does 4.8 square kilometers mean? It is roughly the size of 66 white houses. But we must be clear, Weiyang Palace was not like the Forbidden City. Most of its area was not filled with wooden halls. Instead, it contained gardens, lakes, and many types of auxiliary buildings. Even its most important building, the front hall, looked small and compact within this enormous 4.8 square kilometer complex. The front hall stood slightly east of the center of the palace city. It was not a single isolated hall, but a group of high platform buildings constructed on a massive rammed earth foundation. When the front hall was built, the craftsmen used a method described as cutting down dragon-head plain to build upon it. In other words, they did not begin on flat ground. They first cut down the natural highland of Dragonhead Plain and then raised it even higher through artificial rammed earth construction. From south to north, the front hall complex was divided into 3 main halls: the front, middle, and rear halls. Each level rose higher than the one before it. The height difference from front to back reached 15 meters. The political function of this high platform was to create psychological pressure. Its complex arrangement of southern, central, and northern halls became the model for Chinese imperial palaces for the next 2,000 years. Even the Forbidden City preserved the layout of 3 great halls along a central axis, although on a much smaller scale. The total area of the front hall of Weiyang Palace was about 70,000 square meters. The three great halls of the Forbidden City combined cover only about 25,000 square meters. Imagine this. An envoy from the western regions, or a newly submitted vassal king, enters Chang'an through the southern gate and proceeds north along Anmen Avenue. On his left rises the high wall of Changle Palace. On his right stands the barrier of Weiyang Palace. He passes through the palace gate, enters Weiyang Palace, and climbs step by step up the long stairway. The platform of the front hall grows higher and higher. His own body feels lower and lower. By the time he finally reaches the Great Hall, he has already been overwhelmed, physically and psychologically. This was the logic behind Weiyang Palace. When Liu Bang thought Weiyang Palace was too magnificent, Xiao He, the minister responsible for its construction, replied, "The Son of Heaven takes the four seas as his home. Without magnificence, there is no way to strengthen his majesty." Weiyang Palace was not built for comfort. It was built to strengthen majesty. Close to the front hall, in the southwestern part of the palace city, lay Chang'an, a large artificial lake. It served both as scenery and as a reservoir. Water was brought in through open channels, passed through the whole of Chang'an, and flowed out from the eastern side of Changle Palace. North of the front hall stood Jiaofang Hall, the residence of the Empress. The name Jiaofang came from a special building technique. The walls were coated with a mixture of mud and ground Sichuan pepper. Pepper was believed to be warming. Coating the walls with it could make the palace warm and fragrant, while also preventing insects and decay. At the same time, pepper plants produce many seeds, which gave the name an auspicious association with fertility. In later times, Jiaofang became a symbolic term for the empress's residence, or even for imperial consorts in general. Farther north were the central government offices and royal institutions, such as the Lesser Treasury. In the northern part of the palace city stood Tianlu Pavilion and Shiku Pavilion, the National Library and Archive of the Western Han. So you see, Weiyang Palace was not one building. It was the emperor's residence, centered on the front hall. Court audiences took place in the front hall. Daily life centered on Jiaofang Hall. Decisions were made in government offices. Books were stored in Shiku Pavilion. Scenery was enjoyed at Chang'an. Across 4.8 square kilometers, every corner served the emperor himself.
停了之光，望在唐溪，何以为阳？河水上上，何以不息？山高水长。
Changle Palace was, in theory, the palace of the Empress Dowager. It stood in the southeastern part of Han Chang'an. Changle Palace covered about 6 square kilometers, 1/6 of the total area of Han Chang'an. 6 square kilometers. Changle Palace was even larger than Weiyang Palace. This is a fact worth repeating. The Empress Dowager's palace was larger than the Emperor's palace. The walls of Changle Palace measured about 10 kilometers in circumference, with wall foundations about 20 meters wide. Its plan was nearly square. It consisted of 14 palace buildings, including the front hall and Changxin Hall. The main palace buildings were concentrated in the northwest of the palace city, while garden buildings lay in the northeast. The core building of Changle Palace was Changxin Hall, the sleeping palace of the Empress Dowager. In the early Western Han, Changle Palace had once served as the Imperial Palace itself. Liu Bang governed from here, and Empress Lu had Han Xin killed here. After Emperor Hui of Han, the emperor moved to Weiyang Palace, and Changle Palace became the residence of the Empress Dowager. It was known as the Eastern Palace. Changle Weiyang, everlasting joy without end. From this point on, these two words became one of the great auspicious phrases of the Han Dynasty. Together, they carried a wish for happiness that would last forever and for imperial fortune that would never come to an end. They were not only the names of two palaces, they were stamped onto roof tiles, cast into bronze mirrors, and preserved on countless objects wherever the Han world wanted to leave behind a blessing. But behind this beautiful phrase lay a political danger that would haunt the Han Dynasty for 400 years. The emperor lived in Weiyang Palace. The Empress Dowager lived in Changle Palace. Weiyang Palace had its own commandant of guards, who controlled the palace garrison, and its own privy treasury, the emperor's private household treasury. Changle Palace had the same, a Changle commandant of guards and a Changle privy treasury. The Empress Dowager did not merely have her own palace. She had her own treasury, her own administrative offices, and her own armed guards. And in practice, for much of the Han Dynasty, both the Changle commandant of guards and the Changle privy treasury were controlled by members of the Empress Dowager's own family, the imperial in-laws. The history of the Western Han proved this again and again. When the emperor was young or weak, Changle Palace could become another center of power. Empress Lu, Empress Dowager Do, Wang Zhengjun, every powerful Empress Dowager issued orders from Changle Palace, turning it into the real center of the empire in place of Weiyang Palace. Facing each other across the Imperial Road, the two palaces witnessed too many entanglements and bloody reckonings during 200 years of Western Han history. The coexistence of Changle Palace and Weiyang Palace was not simply a matter of two palaces standing side by side. It was the direct expression in palace layout of the political structure of the Western Han. Weiyang Palace was the emperor's principal palace, the center from which imperial commands were issued. Changle Palace was the palace of the Empress Dowager, the space where maternal authority and the power of imperial in-laws gathered. One stood west, the other east. One belonged to the emperor, the other to the mother. One represented the Son of Heaven's daily rule. The other represented the institutional authority of the Mother Empress within a dynastic family state. This is what made the Western Han different from later dynasties. Later Chinese history certainly still had Empress Dowagers ruling from behind the scenes, powerful in-law families, and even extremely strong female rulers. But these were often political events that emerged from specific crises: child emperors, broken succession, or weakened imperial authority. In the Western Han, however, Empress Dowagers and imperial in-laws were not external forces that accidentally entered the court. They were embedded in the imperial system from the beginning. Changle Palace was not a corner of the inner palace. It was an independent palace city, large enough to stand beside Weiyang Palace and even larger in area. It proves that early Western Han imperial authority was not yet the fully unified autocracy of later periods. It was a family state system formed by the emperor, the Empress Dowager, and the imperial in-law clans together. After the Han Dynasty, the role of Empress Dowagers and in-law clans gradually declined in structural terms. and in later capital designs, no palace would ever again appear that could surpass the residence of the emperor himself. Besides the two giants, Weiyang Palace and Changle Palace, Han Chang'an contained three other important palace compounds: Gui Palace, North Palace, and Mingguang Palace. Gui Palace stood north of Weiyang Palace, close to the western city wall. Its plan was rectangular, about 880 meters from east to west and 1,890 meters from north to south, enclosed by walls on all four sides. Gui Palace was built in the 4th year of the Taichu era of Emperor Wu of Han, in 101 BC. It was built as a residence for imperial consorts. Inside the palace, archaeologists found a large building site believed to be the main palace called Mingguang Hall, as well as a mound-like feature that may have served as an artificial hill associated with Mingguang Hall. In the northern part of Gui Palace, they also found a large storage building made up of 7 small rooms. Some historical texts and studies suggest that after Emperor Wu, this may also have served as one of the long-term residences of the Crown Prince. North Palace stood east of Gui Palace and north of the armory. It was discovered by Archaeological Survey in 1994. Its plan was rectangular, 1,710 meters from north to south and 620 meters from east to west, covering 1.06 million square meters. There are different views about the exact function of North Palace, but in general, historians tend to believe that it was used as a residence for deposed empresses or consorts of former emperors. For example, Zhang Yan, the deposed empress of Emperor Hui, and the famous Zhao Feiyan of the late Western Han. Mingguang Palace was the final puzzle piece among the 11 zones. It lay north of Changle Palace. It was built in 101 BC, also in the 4th year of the Taichu era of Emperor Wu. From 2024 to 2025, archaeologists carried out several rounds of excavation in the Mingguang Palace area and finally confirmed its location and nature. According to the textual record, it was probably used to house palace women. During Emperor Wu's reign, some 2,000 beauties from Yan and Zhao were said to have lived there. In the late Western Han, Wang Mang's daughter, the last Empress Wang of the Western Han, also lived here. Gui Palace, North Palace, Mingguang Palace, each had its own emphasis. Gui Palace served as a residence for consorts and crown princes. North Palace housed deposed empresses or former imperial women. Mingguang Palace functioned as a detached palace or residence for palace women. But all three had one thing in common. They were exclusive spaces of the imperial family. They had nothing to do with ordinary urban life. Between Changle Palace and Weiyang Palace stood a group of buildings of critical importance, the armory. The armory was built in 200 BC, among the first major projects after Liu Bang established Chang'an as his capital. Its plan was rectangular. Its outer wall measured 710 meters from east to west and 322 meters from north to south, with a perimeter of about 2,400 meters. Inside, it was divided into 4 storage buildings. Neatly arranged stone pillar bases still survive today. A large number of weapons were unearthed from the armory, including bronze and iron weapons, as well as bone tags used to label objects. These weapons were the Empire's concentrated military reserves in the capital region. They were all stored right beside the palaces. What does the location of the armory tell us? It was not on the edge of the city. It was not near a military camp. It stood between Changle Palace and Weiyang Palace. This apparently functional structure was not built for the city. It was built for the palaces. What it was meant to defend was never Chang'an as an urban community. It was Changle and Weiyang. Across from the armory, near the southern side of Changle Palace, stood the Gao Temple, the ancestral temple of Liu Bang, the founding emperor. Every new emperor had to come here to worship when ascending the throne. This was an important part of completing the sacred status of the Son of Heaven. The existence of the Gao Temple was therefore not merely about honoring one's ancestors. It was about imperial power itself. The same logic can be seen in the markets of Chang'an. The commercial district of Chang'an lay in the northwestern part of the city. The eastern section was called the Eastern Market, and the western section was called the Western Market. Archaeological survey shows that the Eastern Market measured about 780 meters east to west and 650 to 700 meters north to south. The Western Market measured about 550 meters east to west and 420 to 480 meters north to south. Both markets were surrounded by rammed earth walls. In other words, the Eastern and Western markets together were roughly the same size as the entire Forbidden City in Beijing today. That may sound large, but they occupied only about 2% of the area inside the walls of Chang'an. And pay attention to their location. They were in the northwest corner of the city, far from the palace zone, compressed into a corner of the walled enclosure. Chang'an was not a city that grew around markets. The markets were functional areas inserted into an imperial city. The primary purpose of the Eastern and Western markets was not to make shopping convenient for residents. It was to facilitate palace procurement and the centralized control of handicraft production. A market tower stood over the markets, and they were managed by an official known as the market director. Archaeological investigation in the northwestern market area uncovered coin molds, pottery figurines, and other remains showing that state-run craft workshops existed there. Among the so-called 9 markets of Chang'an in the Han Dynasty, the Western Market was densely filled with various workshops: coin casting, pottery production, metallurgy, and related crafts. Most of these industries were directly controlled by the central government. Their products supplied the court, the army, and state construction projects. The markets formed an economic system serving the palace. They were not public spaces serving urban citizens. They were more like places for state-level exchange and court procurement. In fact, the written records make this clear. Outside the walls of Chang'an, there were all kinds of markets, including large, comprehensive markets and specialized markets. That was where real, everyday life took place. Finally, let us turn to 2 small areas in the northeast of Chang'an, and the area between North Palace and Gui Palace. These were the last 2 puzzle pieces. At last, they belonged to the people, or rather to the residents who lived inside Chang'an. First, let us look at the residences of the elite. Although their precise locations have not all been confirmed, Written records show that Chang'an certainly contained offices for the 3 excellencies and 9 ministers. Many senior officials, including the Chancellor, also lived in Chang'an. In addition, envoys from foreign states and the residences of vassal kingdoms in the capital formed a small but indispensable group of official mansions. Elite residences were mainly concentrated in 2 areas: the Northern Gate first-class mansions near the Northern Gate of Weiyang Palace, and the Eastern Gate first-class mansions south of the Armory. These first-class mansions belonged to marquises, princesses, generals, and chancellors. They were called jiadi, first-class residences. But even these highest-ranking residences were still attachments to the palace zone. They existed for the convenience of people already inseparable from imperial power. They were not about wealth in the modern sense. They were not about social prestige in an independent urban society. They were not connected to anything outside the world of imperial authority. Now let us look at ordinary residents. They were concentrated in the residential wards known as Luli in the northeast of Chang'an, the most basic administrative units of the city. According to written records, Chang'an had 160 Luli. Houses stood densely side by side, and the gates and lanes were long and straight. Each ward was surrounded by walls. A cross-shaped street ran through the center, with gates at both ends that were closed at night. The building density inside the wards was high, but because the city's overall shape was irregular, the wards themselves were not arranged in a perfectly uniform pattern. But notice this: even if all the residential wards are added together, along with the Northern Gate first-class mansions and the Eastern mansions, their total area still falls far short of 1/3 of Chang'an. Beyond that, Chang'an had no public library, no racecourse, no amphitheatre, no arena. Within these 36 square kilometers of walls, more than 2/3 of the space was occupied by palaces, government offices, armories, ancestral temples, and related institutions. The imperial roads divided the city into 11 pieces, and each piece repeated the same message. This place belonged to the imperial house. It worshipped only one man under heaven. This city was not built for citizens. It was built for the emperor. Let us choose the moment that best represents the essence of Western Han imperial power: the accession of a new emperor. Through this moment, we can reconstruct how every person, object, and institution inside this 36 square kilometer palace city revolved around one man, the Son of Heaven. It all begins deep in the night. In the summer palace of Weiyang, before dawn has broken, the deep palace suddenly erupts in alarm. Large numbers of attendants rush out through the palace gates, down the steps toward the carriages, and into every corner of the palace city. Some hurry to the office of the capital commandant. Some rush to the armory. Some go to the Chancellor's office. But the most urgent messengers head to Changle Palace and Gui Palace. They do not even have time to change into mourning clothes. They must carry out one exact and unmistakable message as quickly as possible. The previous emperor has died. When the news reaches the Crown Prince's residence in Gui Palace, north of Weiyang Palace and across the Imperial Road, the Crown Prince is shocked and grief-stricken. He quickly changes into mourning clothes, clothes that in truth had probably already been prepared. The maids and eunuchs of Gui Palace hurriedly help him bathe and dress. They also wrap white mourning cloth around their own heads. After the confusion, the Crown Prince's carriage, drawn by 3 white horses, leaves Gui Palace under the protection of guards and enters the road system. After exiting the palace gate of Gui Palace, the carriage turns right and carefully travels along the side road rather than crossing the Imperial Road. Yes, even at this moment, he is still only the Crown Prince. He is not yet the son of Heaven. According to ritual law, he has no right to travel on the central Imperial Road. The procession detours west to the city gate, crosses around the Imperial Road through the gate, and then turns east into Weiyang Palace. According to ritual, the previous emperor's coffin is placed in the front hall. Dressed in mourning clothes, the Crown Prince follows the attendants up the high steps, enters the front hall, kneels before the coffin, and cries aloud. This is both a release of personal grief and an indispensable ritual act. By this time, the previous emperor's wife, the Empress, has already arrived. She may not even be the Crown Prince's birth mother, but there is no doubt that at this moment, she is the highest authority in the entire front hall. One after another, the most important officials of the court arrive at the front hall in mourning clothes, including the 3 excellencies and 9 ministers. Then comes the ceremony of urging accession. The senior ministers kneel on the ground and speak to the Crown Prince, urging him to ascend the throne quickly and become the new emperor. Naturally, the Crown Prince must refuse. After repeated requests, and finally under the witness of the former Empress, the Crown Prince agrees to take the throne. Then high officials, led by the Grand Commandant, read the late Emperor's edict, appointing the Crown Prince as the new Emperor. They then kneel and present to him the Imperial Jade Seal, passed down since the Qin Dynasty. All of this takes place under the witness of the former Empress, symbolizing the transfer of power. Next comes an extremely important procedure. The assembled officials and the new emperor temporarily withdraw to the rear hall. There they take off their mourning clothes and change into auspicious court dress, normal ceremonial clothing for a joyous occasion. Then they return to the front hall and kneel to pay homage to the new emperor. The new emperor ascends the imperial seat. At this point, the accession ceremony is formally complete. Afterward, the mourning rites for the previous emperor continue as usual. All officials and the emperor himself must wear mourning clothes and strictly follow ritual rules. From the death of the previous emperor to his final burial in the imperial mausoleum, the whole process often lasts more than 10 days. During this period, the newly enthroned emperor usually does not live in Weiyang Palace. Instead, he returns to Gui Palace, maintaining an atmosphere of simple mourning while also preparing for every aspect of the transition. At the same time, he must complete another major ritual process. He must go to the Gao Temple south of Chang'an to worship Gaozu, the founding emperor, and announce to his ancestors that he has succeeded to the throne. 27 days after the previous emperor is formally buried in the mausoleum, the mourning period ends. By then, the former empress has usually been formally installed as the new Empress Dowager. She leaves Weiyang Palace and moves into Changle Palace to begin her life as Empress Dowager. Only after this entire process is complete have the previous occupants of Weiyang Palace fully moved out. The attendants and servants of Weiyang Palace then begin sweeping rooms, cleaning halls, and wiping down objects. This was called purifying the palace. When all preparations are complete, the new emperor chooses an auspicious day and hour to depart from Gui Palace and enter Weiyang Palace. At this moment, his identity has changed. He is no longer the successor who has not yet formally taken possession. He has truly become the one man under heaven. On the day of the grand enthronement ceremony, the imperial guards move out to clear the imperial roads of Chang'an, controlling the crowds of ordinary people who want to watch the spectacle, and ensuring the smooth passage of the emperor's procession. Under the eyes of thousands, the emperor's carriage sets out from Weiyang Palace. Guided by ceremonial guards and cavalry, it proceeds in grand formation through the eastern gate tower of Weiyang Palace and reaches the front hall. Wearing the full crown and court robes of the emperor, the Son of Heaven climbs the long steps of Weiyang Palace alone and enters the great hall of the front hall once more. But this time, his identity is completely different from every other time he has entered this place in his life. From this moment on, he is its true master. After the new emperor enters the great hall of the front hall, he usually issues a proclamation to the empire, rewards meritorious officials, and announces a new reign era. That is, a new era name. This means that the new emperor has drawn a clean line between himself and the previous order of rule. The cries of "Long live the emperor" roll from inside the hall to outside it, from the upper platform to the lower court, from within the palace to beyond the palace walls. Like a mountain roar and a sea surge, they witness the new beginning of the empire. While the new emperor completes these acts in the great hall of the front hall, the new empress usually enters Jiaofang Palace on the same day. In this hall, built specifically for the empress, she will govern the inner palace of Weiyang. But we must remember, at this moment, she is not yet the most senior imperial woman on the Western Han political stage. In fact, an empress would often taste real power only after she had endured long enough to become Empress Dowager and move into Changle Palace. Where there is joy, there is also sorrow. Almost at the same time, the consorts left behind by the previous emperor must undergo inspection and verification by officials. Then they are sorted and dealt with according to category. Some are sent back to their families. Others are sent to North Palace or Weiyang Palace, into idle palace chambers. They may not be forced to worry about survival, but the rest of their lives will be consumed day after day in boredom and endless waiting. At the very end, the Son of Heaven finally turns his attention to human lives. Generally speaking, a new emperor would issue 2 edicts upon accession. One was a general amnesty. Except for those guilty of the most unforgivable crimes, all prisoners were released. This was a costly and almost legally irrational act of indiscriminate generosity, designed to win the hearts of the people. The other was often the distribution of beef and wine to the elderly throughout the empire. The exact quantities are no longer known to us, but this was a real favor, a tangible grace. And it was one of the few rays of light sent out from Chang'an, this vast palace city inhabited by the Son of Heaven alone, toward the world under heaven. Now let us look at Rome in the same era. Rome was a city of the people. Under Augustus, Rome already possessed the scale of an empire. But in form, it still preserved the shell of a republic. It had a senate, forums, temples, theatres, baths, roads for triumphal processions, and an urban life crowded together by citizens, merchants, slaves, soldiers, and foreigners. Augustus, of course, held supreme power in practice, but his power had to be packaged as authority granted by the Senate and people of Rome. He did not descend into the human world as the Son of Heaven. He stood at the center of the Republican stage as the first citizen. Therefore, Roman urban space itself was a form of political performance. The Forum was not a palace monopolized by the emperor. It was a public space made up of citizens, senators, courts, temples, and monuments. The authority of the Roman emperor had to be displayed before the people. It had to gain nominal recognition within the traditions of the Senate. It had to be proven again and again through triumphs, arenas, public buildings, and gifts to the city. Rome was a city that belonged to an empire. But first, it had to look like a city that belonged to the people. This is the most fundamental difference between Rome and Han Chang'an. Rome placed the emperor inside the city and hid imperial power within the public spaces of the republic and the people. Han Chang'an, by contrast, pulled the city itself into the structure of imperial power. The center of Rome was the forum, the senate, and a public life visible to the people. The center of Chang'an was the palace, the ancestral temple, government offices, the armory, storage facilities, and a ritual order centered on the Son of Heaven. One empire still needed to borrow the name of the people to justify the power of the emperor. The other empire directly built the order of all under heaven into the emperor's residence. And so these two political systems ultimately pointed toward two completely different paths of power in East and West.